Hello and good afternoon, everybody. We'll give folks just a moment to come on in before we start talking about this week's negotiation workshop. Just going to give folks till 12:01 or 12:02 as folks trickle in. I know it is lunchtime, so grab your lunch, grab your refill of your coffee, and get ready to go. Okay, I know folks are still coming in, but we'll get started right now and talk about this week's salary negotiation and negotiation workshop. So today's topic is negotiating, financial agreements with Dr. Joshua Weiss, who we are very excited to partner with today. My name is Jessica Keegan. I'm from the Office of Economic Empowerment, which is a department of the State Treasurer and Receiver Generals of Massachusetts. I'll be here in the chat just in case you have any question, and make sure that you have the resources that the doctor is mentioning. But just go through an agenda very briefly. I'll just mention some disclosure. We'll go ahead and dive into the meat of the presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. And of course, feel free to put anything you need in the chat. You may have noticed that this is a webinar and not your standard meeting. So that means you cannot come off mute, you cannot turn on your camera, but you can feel free to use the Q&A and the chat as you need for us. This will be recorded, and the recording may be uploaded onto a public website for future use. So we'll make sure you all get the link to this recording, so that way you can reference it in the future, and anybody who might be missing will be able to share it as well. And of course, this chat record is subject to public record laws and is not anonymous. So I will stop sharing my screen and let Dr. Weiss continue on.
Great, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and start sharing mine and just get you into slideshow mode here. And one more, there we go.
And
all right,
perfect.
Everybody see that okay? Great, okay. Well, thank you very much, Jessica. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk a little bit about financial agreement negotiations. These are the kinds of things that are very much part of our lives, and there's actually quite a bit that you can negotiate if you think about it in that way. Just to step back for 1 second, this is kind of a standalone webinar, but it's also part of a series that we've been doing. And we had two previous webinars. One was really on negotiating 101 and kind of challenging some myths that you all might have about negotiation, what effective negotiation looks like, etc. And then the second one was on salary negotiation and how to think about that, how to approach it, do's and don'ts, etc. Those are available and posted on social media and other places if you did miss those and would like to to kind of catch up on some of those. But as I said, it's not a prerequisite for today. And so, if you weren't able to make it, not a problem. So let me give you a sense of where we're going to head. And as Jessica mentioned, I'm going to do my best to try to share with you for 35, 40 minutes, something like that, hopefully. And then really like to open it up to questions. If you do have questions along the way, feel free to pop them in the chat. I do have it open, and I will try to address them if it kind of fits with the flow. And if not, I'll come back around to them at the end. And also, yeah, so if you have questions in that way, please don't hesitate. So I'm going to begin with what is negotiation, because lots of us have views and perspectives on what a negotiation is. So we'll get that out on the table right away, if I can use a little bit of a negotiation pun. Then let's talk about understanding why it's important to negotiate financial agreements. A lot of times people just take these scenarios in and think that what's in front of them is the only way forward. And in fact, much of the time, that's not the case. There are many things that are negotiable within this particular context. And so good to understand that and to think that through. We'll also talk about the different kind of financial agreements and what to look for when you're negotiating them. And then I want to just make sure that you have a little time to think about how to prepare for financial agreement negotiations. My view on preparation is that it's an essential part of the process. So if you aren't preparing for your negotiations, you're preparing to fail. Pretty simple. People will often come back to me and say, okay, fair enough, but I don't really have time. The only thing I can tell you is you have to make time, because information is the currency of negotiation. Okay, it's pretty simple. And so the more we know, the more we've taken the time to think through what may happen, what's negotiable. When it comes to these kinds of agreements, the better off we're going to be. Now, I will just tell you very briefly that there are three phases to a negotiation process: the preparation phase, the agreement phase, and the implementation, or the actual negotiation is the second phase, I should say. And then the implementation, where we often have to negotiate further when things arise. If I take 100% of my time when it comes to those three phases, I would probably break it down as 60% of my time is spent in the preparation phase, 20% in the actual negotiation, and another 20% in the implementation and subsequent negotiations that arise during that period. So you can see that preparation becomes a fundamental element to what we're doing. And the more you know about what's negotiable, what's not, the better off you're going to be, right? Because you can dig into those areas. And if you don't know that those things are negotiable, you'll miss out. Okay. So let's start with kind of a basic notion here. What is negotiation from your point of view? So don't look at what I have there, but for you, in a word or two or a sentence, put down what a negotiation is to you in the chat box, please. So don't hesitate. So I assume folks are able to put some stuff in the chat. Hopefully we'll start seeing some of those. Okay, so here we go. So we've got compromise. We've got a way to meet my needs and the employee's needs, getting the best possible deal for yourself. Okay. Negotiation to where all basics are met, not just money. Great. What else we got? Agreement between stakeholders for common interest. Okay, good. All right, we got some good ideas in here. So let me just say to you, as you can see on the screen, my what I wrote here is a discussion to see if an agreement on a desired objective makes sense and is the best way forward. So the reason I say that is because a lot of times people define negotiation, and in fact, they define the goal of negotiation as reaching agreement. That's actually not the goal of negotiation, and that may surprise you. The goal of negotiation is to meet your objective as best as possible. In anything we do in life, we want to have a goal and objective, right? And if you go through a negotiation process and at the end of it, you say, okay, this really meets my objective as best as possible, then an agreement makes sense. But if you do that and you get to a place and say, what's being offered here isn't actually the best way forward for me, then you shouldn't say yes. And this is sort of a really important point, because when we walk into a room and we think about what our objective is, if we change the view of negotiation from the purpose of negotiation is for me to meet my objective as best as possible, okay, that's where we want to be, as opposed to the purpose of negotiation is to reach agreement, you can see how it changes everything that we're going to do, right? It's actually not very hard to reach agreement in negotiation. You can give away lots of things in order to get an agreement, right? But what you want is the best agreement possible that meets your objectives and your goals, right? And negotiation is one tool to do that in the course of life. And there are other ways to go about this, but that's really how those of us in the field of negotiation view it. And what's interesting is when I share this perspective with people, they often feel a bit of a sense of relief, because a lot of people go in thinking, if I didn't reach agreement, I failed. And that's actually not true, right? If you could meet your interests better elsewhere through not reaching agreement or something like that, that's actually success. So keep that in mind as we go forward. right? Imagine in a financial negotiation, say with a credit card company, let's say that they're offering you really bad terms because your credit score is really bad. Well, you might say, if I were to get myself in trouble here and not be able to pay back my bills at the end of the month, the terms that are being offered are really bad. So maybe I ought to think about another way to do this. Maybe I could get a loan from a bank instead with a much different lower interest rate, right? So again, we're back to what meets our objective as best as possible, right? So with that sort of level set, let me say one thing about a key to negotiation. So one of the real challenges that we face in negotiation is that we always work with incomplete information. So I'm going to say that again because it's really important. We always work with incomplete information. That's why I said that the currency of negotiation is information. So the more the information we have, the better off we're going to be. The more we're going to be able to consider all of our options and all of our ways forward strategically. But you have to understand that when you sit down to negotiate with somebody, you know certain things about the situation, you know what's important to you, and perhaps you know the industry standards and things like that. But you don't know what's important to the other side, what their objectives are, what kind of pressure they're under. So we're working in that way with uncertainty. And for a lot of people, that's very uncomfortable, but it's the reality of negotiation. And so later we'll talk about how do you prepare for a negotiation. A lot of people want a concrete plan. I'm going to do A, then I'm going to do B, and then I'm going to get to C. And I can tell you right now, if that's what you're looking for, you're going to struggle in your negotiations because that's not how negotiation works. When I sit down to negotiate with somebody, I expect that they're going to tell me things that I had not thought were part of the negotiation, or that they have a constraint that I didn't even realize because they have information I don't. So when you go into negotiations, we use, like a lot of fields, the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule is, as you sit down to prepare, you can prepare for about 80% of what's going to happen. You can think through different aspects of things. But also, there's about 20% you're not going to know, and it's going to reveal itself slowly over time during that negotiation if you give it time to come about. Sometimes we quickly rush to an agreement, we compromise on things that are very important to us, and we don't ever find out those things that we didn't know that could actually be really, really valuable for us. And that just leads me to one thing that I want to mention before I keep moving on here, which is, for some reason, people think that when they negotiate, they should try to get their negotiation done and finished as fast as they can. I don't know why. Nobody ever said you should do this quickly unless there's a time deadline, right? So one great benefit that people who negotiate understand is patience. Slow the process down. Unless there's a reason to agree in the moment, or to, that you're under a very tight deadline, take your time. Because what you'll find is this information that you're missing will slowly come to light if you give it the time to do so. And even the very notion of stepping away and sleeping on something instead of agreeing in the moment is a very useful tactic. I almost never agree to something in the moment, because what I've learned is that when I do take the time to step away, I actually notice things that I wasn't noticing in the moment that are really important. And so if I come back the next day and say, I thought about it, and this agreement actually doesn't quite meet my goals for this reason, I'm much less prone to making mistakes that way. And sometimes we call that going to the balcony, kind of stepping away from the situation to give yourself a little bit of time to think about it. Because when we're in the moment, that's actually when we make our biggest mistakes. We've all had the instance where we've agreed to something and walked out of the room and said to ourselves, why did I just do that? And maybe give yourself a kick in the pants, right? And say, what just happened there? Like, I should have never agreed to that. It didn't meet my interests. But we did it because maybe we felt pressure. Maybe we felt like we're supposed to say that. You get it. Okay. So keep that in mind, that there's no rush here. And in fact, the slower that you go in your negotiations, often the better that's going to serve you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these financial agreements and these longer term kind of scenarios that we're going to engage in over the course of our lifetimes. So of course, these have to do with money or credit or things along those lines. And the examples that I'm going to talk through are about negotiating with credit card companies around a mortgage if you're planning on buying a home, a car payment, or a lease agreement, just to give you an example of what these things look like as part of the process. Okay, so let's go ahead and sort of dive in here and help you to understand some of this. So what's unique about negotiating financial agreements? I think the first thing is that we often experience the complexity of financial terms. This is a place where if you're not sure what certain things mean, of course, you can use the web. But there are other people out there that can help you, and we'll talk about that. And again, we're back to making sure you know what you're signing. And so be clear about the financial terms and what people are saying to you, because the devil, as I mentioned later, is in the details. So it's also critical to kind of tailor agreements to meet some of the needs that you have. And, a lot of the companies that are engaged in these longer term negotiations, they have sort of boilerplate contracts. They have things that they take into consideration, but you might have certain circumstances or specific circumstances that you need to address that may not be the norm. And those are the kinds of things that you want to think about and you want to even raise in your negotiations to see if there's a way that a company can work with you when it comes to that. Imagine that you don't have the greatest credit. Are there ways in which companies can work with you on that to build that credit? Also, because you're hoping to work with these folks over time, I mean, a home mortgage, sometimes we're talking about a 30-year mortgage, right? And that requires the building of strong relationships. Sometimes people don't really understand that, but I've noticed that when I work with companies over a longer time period, I'm able to ask them for things. I'm able to talk to them about some of the constraints that I have and get extensions to deadlines that people don't necessarily think you can achieve. So, we've worked for many years with an insurance company, a smaller insurance company. And when I have a problem or a challenge, I can call them up and say, hey, can I talk to my agent who's worked with me for 15 years? And we kind of think together about what to do about that problem. So building relationships is going to help you as you go through this process. Don't just think of it as dealing with a behemoth kind of company that doesn't care about you. Find somebody there that you can build a relationship with and connect with over time. And then again, the last thing is the importance of reading the contract, making sure that you know the contract inside and out, because if you run into a problem, the devil is ultimately in the details. So why do you think, and again, let's go back to the chat for a second. Why do you think it's important to negotiate financial agreements? What do you think you can achieve by kind of digging in, not just accepting what they give you, but what do you think you can do by negotiating some of these things? Give me a few thoughts in the chat box, please. How can it help you? We have a little delay in the chat box, but I'm sure those ideas are coming. All right, so have idiosyncratic needs met. Everyone has different situations, resources, and preferences. So Casey, you're exactly right. And the thing is that in these scenarios, one of the things that we talk a lot about is what do you value? And what that means is what's important to you, right? So for some people, it's a longer contract term. For other people, it's interest rates, right? For other people, it might be that you've got a poor credit score for some reason and you've got to manage that. So all these negotiations are not the same. And Casey, you're exactly right that we have these different needs and we have to articulate them and share them with the people that we're dealing with, so that we can essentially try to meet those. And again, if we go back to the idea of incomplete information, right? Um, the other side may not know these are the needs that we have, and they might actually be able to meet those needs, but they can't if we don't mention them, right? So this is where the whole idea is to ask. Make sure that you're asking, make sure that you're putting a number of issues on the table as part of the process. So, okay, budgeting, a greater sense of fairness. I know what I can afford to spend, right? And compromise between negotiators. So we'll come back to that on some level. I'm actually, as a quick aside, I'm not a huge fan of compromise. Compromise to me, and I've written quite a bit about this if you're interested in a more detailed understanding of why I say this. Compromise is about fast decisions. It's not always about the best decisions. And so you can always compromise. But what I would really recommend is that you don't rush to compromise. Try to understand what are the things that negotiators really need to make this work. And sometimes what you find when you get down to that level is that compromise isn't always necessary. So I won't go on much more about that, but in the other webinars, we do talk about this, and it's a really important idea because people, when people leave a negotiation process and they've compromised things that they feel are really important, it doesn't feel very satisfying. In fact, it's the opposite. They almost wish they hadn't negotiated, and it's actually why people don't like to negotiate, because they feel like they've got to give up something that's really important to them. And I'm not suggesting sometimes we don't have to compromise, but what I am suggesting is hold off on your compromises. You can always compromise on something at the very end if you need to, but make it the last stop on the train, not the first, if you will. Okay. So Henry asks, can't asking also break the negotiation down sometimes? My experience is actually that it very much depends on how you ask. If you say, listen, I've got a problem or a challenge that I could use your help with, and it's, that I've run into a problem with my credit. And so I need to keep that, as part of the conversation. And I'm wondering if there's a way that you can work with me, right? And the other side says, well, what does that look like? What does that mean? So questions to me are also about tonality. They're about, if you're in a problem solving mode, if you don't view the other negotiator as an adversary, because they're not. Like if you're dealing with a credit card company and you want them to give you a credit card, but there are some problems, they're not your adversary. You need to work with them. You need to find a way to make something happen, right? So I don't see them as my friend. So let me be clear about that. But what I do see them as sort of like a problem-solving partner, that we have a problem, like I want your credit card, you want me to have this credit card, but there are some things that are standing in the way. So how can we get to the place where we're both satisfied? So I think it's a little bit like, the art of diplomacy, somebody once said, is the ability to disagree without being disagreeable. There's a difference. You and I can have a good disagreement, but I don't have to be disagreeable. I don't have to tell you you're incompetent and things along those lines. So I actually think, and one of the goals in negotiation, because again, if we go back to the notion of incomplete information, how do you get information? You get it by asking questions and listening carefully for what's coming back to you. So I'm a big fan of questions. I actually think the best negotiators and the people that I work with, they're much better at asking questions than they are about having all the answers. So that's my take on it all, but you can sit with that and see what you think. So the importance of negotiating financial agreements, again, is to clarify terms and expectations, build trust and cooperation with the parties for the long term, and to hopefully get some favorable terms, and get a better understanding of the rights and protections that you have under the law. Okay, because there are a lot of rights and protections, and it's important for you to know what those look like. So let's kind of begin to get into the longer term negotiation piece. And one thing that I just want to mention that I think people often overlook is your credit score. Now, credit score, of course, becomes really important in terms of your ability to do all of these things. So I think before you get into getting a mortgage, getting a credit card, making car payments, things like that, review your credit score periodically and try to find ways of improving your credit score. There are ways, and there's help that is out there in terms of helping you to sort of figure out how you can get better. And I'll mention that in a little bit. But if you don't have a great credit score, there are ways that you can fix that, and it will help you in your negotiations because you become a much more attractive candidate when you're sitting down to go through these if you have a good credit score. So paying your bills on time, finding ways to catch up on overdue bills. Again, back to the point about credit card interest rates. They're some of the highest that are out there. So if you are unable to pay your bills, you might want to consider a loan that's fixed in at a 5-6% as opposed to 18-20% on a credit card bill, and pay that off and work on that. That's something that you can do. If you do have a challenged credit score, there's something called an authorized user, where you can actually get somebody who you know and trust who has a good credit score to co-sign. If you're a young person, that might be your parents, it could be a spouse or whatever. There are other ways, like a secured credit card. Not many people know about this, but there's a type of credit card that you can get if you have bad credit that requires a security deposit, but still enables you to do that. Keep some of your credit available always. It's a very good rule of thumb. If you max things out, it creates a problem for you. Obviously, only applying for the credit you need and live within your means. There are ways that you can kind of step back and say, okay, I've got to take some control here of what's going on. So think about ways of managing your credit score, because that's a preparation piece. And it's very important for you because this is going to set your negotiations up in a good way for the future and to actually secure these loans or lines of credit or whatever it is you need. So let's talk about these 4 types of financial agreements. I'm mindful of the time here, so let me kind of work my way through these and then I'll take your questions. So credit card payments, home mortgage, car payment, and lease agreements, okay? So with credit card payments, the most important of all these, again, regarding the credit card score. Now, you can negotiate with credit card companies and debt collectors. There are a lot of credit card companies out there, and it's worth it for you to think about what you want and go from one card company to the next, trying to find the best deal for you. Of course, there are a lot of options, and credit card companies, for many people, you can certainly negotiate and get a better sense if you've got 3 or 4 different companies that you're talking to. You can say, well, I was working with Citibank and they can offer me this. What can you guys do, right? They do want to compete for your business, and there's nothing wrong with that. So it's important to do some of that homework. Don't just agree to the first scenario with one credit card company. Think about it and try to think and do some shopping around. Figure out what the industry standards are for all of these things. Now, there are some challenges because there are standard terms and conditions, but it never hurts to ask, right? And the things that can be negotiated are interest rates, depending on, again, back to your credit score, things like that. Sometimes you can negotiate away annual fees, or they might have a different credit card that doesn't have annual fees that's worth asking about. Credit limit, penalties and fees, payment due date, things like that. And there are programs that if you get stuck, that can help, like the one there, MassachusettsDebtRelief.org, can give you advice if you've gotten yourself into a problem or a challenge. So look for those resources. Again, we're back to information gathering and things like that. Jessica just popped the link in the chat box for all of you. So there are resources for you, and you have to know where to look. We are living in a world that is often overflowing with information. So it's not just finding any information, it's finding the right information that's important. So mortgages and home mortgages. So negotiate with bank lenders. Like I said, they want your business. And especially in this market, there's a lot of opportunity as a buyer to negotiate in this context. During the real estate transactions, again, comparison shop, there's a concept called BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And really what it means is, what are your alternatives, right? And so if there are a number of bank lenders out there and one is offering, 4.5%, 5% on a 10-year mortgage, are there others that are offering the same terms with a lower interest rate? It takes time and you got to figure it out, but it's worth looking around. And so you can use the competition to kind of play people off each other and figure out what the best rates are. And there are places where you can negotiate. Again, interest rates, depending on um, your background and things like that, but also the loan term, right? There are, you can get a 30-year mortgage that's going to have a slightly higher interest rate, but if you want an adjustable rate mortgage, that's going to have a lower interest rate that might actually be helpful to you. And you can certainly negotiate the down payment depending on different situations. And know some of the nuances of negotiating these things, right? So, for example, if you put down 20%, you don't have to escrow for insurance and taxes. That might be to your benefit. If you don't have 20% to put down, well, then you can think about how to manage it. Look at, importantly, default provisions. If in fact somehow you have to default, what happens, legal ramifications and penalties, and can you start payments as close to the closing as possible? There are lots of ways of managing the different dimensions, but you have to know that you can ask for these things and not just accept what's being put in front of you. Okay. So car payments, negotiating with car dealerships and finance companies, again, lots of opportunity. You wouldn't know it if you're sitting down at a particular dealer, but if you shop around, you will find out that there are different possibilities. Recently, we were going to buy a car because all our cars are old, and we were actually going to buy a used car, but the dealer that we worked with was actually doing a 0% down deal for 5 years. So they were essentially giving us kind of free money for 5 years. And so we decided to buy a new car, which I had never bought a new car in my entire life. But when we looked at the payments based on what was in front of us, maybe a 6 to 7% loan versus the 0%, it actually made sense to buy a new car as opposed to buying, a car with 30 or 40,000 miles on it. So it's that kind of an analysis that's valuable to do as you comparison shop. But during car purchases, of course, you can negotiate the purchase price, the down payment. If you don't have a lot of money to put down, that's something that you can work with. Monthly payment amount. Again, if you're going to struggle to make those payments, don't strap yourself. Try to extend the term of the loan that you're working with to reduce your payments, to lower things. Look at the warranty. If you're gonna have to get a higher interest car loan, would your parents or a colleague or your partner be willing to co-sign with you who has better credit? Not uncommon. We did that for our daughter, and that helped them. Pre-penalty payments can be taken away. You can negotiate that away, shop for the best loan, and is there some kind of return policy as well, related to car payments and the longer term loans that you might take out. Okay. Then the last one is lease agreements. So negotiating with a landlord or property manager. So it's really critical to ensure that the terms and conditions of the apartment, whatever, meet your needs, right? And again, there's room to negotiate here. So lease term, sometimes it might be beneficial if you're in transition, you don't know where you're going to be in a year or two, to negotiate a month-to-month lease. And maybe you're willing to pay a little more or year or multi-year contract, right? If you're tired of moving around, it might be valuable for you to have a multi-year lease so that you don't have to worry about going somewhere else. The rental amount and the security deposit, those can be negotiated. Again, look at industry standards, look around in the neighborhood that you're wanting to rent and say, next door, I found a condo that is comparable, and yet your rent is $300 more a month. Can you help me understand why? Like, what do you have that the other doesn't? And the thing is that a lot of times people expect you to negotiate, but most people don't. They just take it as, okay, this is the deal. So it's always worth asking about those things. Pet policy, rules on the ground, the end of the lease agreement, can you break the lease agreement without an early termination? And honestly, the best rentals that I had when I was younger, I really worked to build a relationship with the landlord. So when you need them, they're there for you. If you get a broken pipe and they don't like you, they're not going to show up right away. But if they do, they're going to come and deal with it. And so, going out of your way of not just treating them as a landlord, that you have no relationship with and that's transactional, try to get to know them. They've got problems and challenges as well. And the more they know you, the more you know them, the more they're going to be able to work with you if something comes up and something got changed. Jessica wrote, I negotiated not needing to make 3 times the amount of rent as a salary by showing my credit score and my debt payments. Exactly. There you go. So the bottom line is a lot of these things are negotiable, but we have to think about what are those things, for example, in a lease agreement that are really important to me. It's not just the rent and the amount you're going to pay, but all of these other things. And that's one of the messages I really want to leave with you is that in these negotiations, there are a lot of things that we value. Remember, I mentioned that earlier, that value is anything that's important to you in a negotiation. So think broadly, right? When you're going to go and look for an apartment, what do you need? What are you really trying to get from a situation? And how do you bring that up in your conversations? Like, don't hesitate. The nice thing about negotiation is there's no real rules. There's nothing that's off the table. You don't know what the answer is going to be unless you ask. And so that's really one of the keys. I had a colleague that I worked with, and on his door, he had a great saying that I've mentioned before. And it says, if you ask and the answer is no, you feel stupid for 5 minutes. If you never ask, you feel stupid for the rest of your life. So I don't want you to feel stupid for the rest of your life. I want you to ask and to see what's possible. And most people, again, are not going to say, get out because you asked, right? Again, think about how to ask it. Think about the tone and the way in which you want to ask a question, but don't hesitate to do that. And sometimes the reason we don't ask is we create a story in our minds of what's going to happen if we do ask, right? So if I think to myself, well, I'm going to ask about this, and they're going to get upset, and they're going to say, I'm not renting to you, and they're going to end the negotiation. Well, you've already talked yourself out of asking for that thing. Remember, landlords and others need to rent their space too. And if they're meeting with you, there's a pretty good reason why they're meeting with you, right? That you bring some value to the table. Always remember that, whether it's when it comes to these kinds of negotiations or salary or anything, there's a reason you're sitting at the table. You bring some value, and the key is to figure out what does that look like, okay? Now, I've got a few more minutes. I just want to talk about preparing because we often do this wrong. And we will share previous links to those other webinars, Marjana. So, and feel free to reach out to Jessica and others, and she'll do that. So when we think about preparation for these kinds of negotiations, what people usually want is the little image on the top that says your plan, okay? So what we want and what we think we can do with this is that we're going to get on our bike and we're going to, we're going to do A and then B, and then we're going to get to the finish line, which is C. Okay. And that's not how negotiation works. I can tell you that right now. The other side doesn't really care about your plan, and they don't even know you have a plan. And if it's so concrete that you don't have a way forward that's different, like if you run into circumstances or the other side says, yeah, that's not going to be possible, what do you do then? This is the reason that we get the freak out factor in negotiation, as I like to put it. And my students often say to me, if I have a plan, I'm good. And then they will tell me, I went into this negotiation with a plan. I thought it was going to work out really well. And then the other side asked me a question or said, yeah, we can't do that. And I didn't know where to go from there because they're preparing in a way that doesn't help them. So what you need to do is you need to engage in what I would call preparation or contingency planning. So the reality of negotiation is actually the image that you see on the bottom of your screen, that we have to go over valleys, through hills, across oceans in order to get where we want to go. And obviously I'm using metaphors here, right? It's a rocky road. Excuse me. It's a rocky road that is very unpredictable. So the best way to prepare is to think more broadly. You still have a specific objective in your negotiation, but what you want to do is have a number of different ways to get to that same end, right? So if any of you play board games like chess or things like that, it's really valuable to have your objective, but to say, okay, I'm going to start down this road of taking this move. And then they're going to make another move, which is how negotiation works, right? And if my first sort of moves, I thought they were going to take me down this road and that didn't happen, what am I going to do then, right? So having 3 or 4 ways to get to the same end is really valuable. And it's based on contingencies. It's based on assuming and understanding that, again, we don't have all the information we need and that the landscape of negotiation is unclear. It looks much more like what's on the bottom than on the top. So we have to prepare for those unexpecteds. We have to go in with a flexible mindset. And that's one of the most important things that you can develop is expect the unexpected when you engage in a negotiation. So no question is really off the table, if I can put it that way. And you're going to be a lot less surprised and a lot less freaked out if you go in and say, I know that the other side is going to ask me something and I haven't really thought about that. So I'm going to prepare for that kind of thing. And if I don't know the answer, don't respond. Say, I'm going to have to think about that. Can I get back to you in an hour or tomorrow? Right? Don't put pressure on yourself to respond in the moment, even if the other side is putting pressure on you. It's better to let it go than to agree to a bad deal, right? But when you get your head around all of this, and when you go into a negotiation, you say, okay, I know I want to get this car with these features, right? And I'm going to be open to how that might happen. Maybe I want maybe I'm going to end up with a longer term car payment, but at lesser money, or, whatever it might be. Or maybe I'm not going to put down as much money so that I can be more secure in making those car payments, things like that. So I've thought through and I've given myself some options so that I don't get too worried about things. And the other piece to this that's important is this idea of your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, your BATNA. I mentioned it before, I'll mention it again now. So your BATNA answers a simple question, which is, if we don't reach an agreement in this particular process, what am I going to do then? Sometimes it's also called your walkaway alternative. So if I'm meeting with a car dealer, right, and I want to purchase a car, and I don't really like the terms or things like that, your BATNA in that situation is to go to another car dealer and ask them about what they can offer, and maybe go to another one. So you're comparison shopping, right? And the nice thing about that reality, whether it's buying a home or a car, is there are a lot of cars out there. There are a lot of homes out there that could be satisfactory to you. I would caution you, one of the things that I caution my kids and others that I know who go into these negotiations is don't get too attached to any one car, to any one house, because that's when you spend more than you should. That's when you do things that aren't actually quite rational. Okay. You go beyond what your limits are, and that will never be good for us. But it's always valuable to ask yourself, if we don't reach agreement here, what happens? How good or bad is it? And I think you'll find, especially with these longer term kind of financial arrangements, that you have a lot of alternatives. There are lots of other companies offering a similar product. So use that to your advantage. Too often, people don't think about that. And there's another great advantage that you have today that people didn't have 20 years ago, which is you have the internet. And the internet is a wealth of information. So do your homework. Before you ever get in the room, you can do all kinds of homework that's going to really help you in that negotiation, right? So if you're negotiating around a car and you notice that the dealer that you're negotiating with at that moment is asking $2,000 more for that car than another dealer with similar kind of car and same kind of mileage and things like that, that's when you say, well, how did you arrive at that? Because I went on to Kelley Blue Book, or even a better site is Galves. GALVES.com tells you actually what dealers pay wholesale for cars. Now, that information is really valuable for me. If I'm going to buy a car, if I know a dealer paid $10,000 for this car, well, then I now know that they're going to build in some profit, which is normal and reasonable, but I have a really good benchmark for how to understand that, right? So it's, again, not just any information, but do your homework and find the right information that's out there, that takes some time and effort before you sit down. And what you're going to notice, and a lot of people say this to me, when I go into negotiate for a car or whatever it might be, I get really anxious. Part of the reason you get anxious is because you're not prepared. You haven't done this homework. If you've done your homework and you know what the industry standards are and things like that, you can just ask. There's no real reason to be nervous because you have a pretty good sense of what you ought to be paying for these things and not what somebody's going to try to take advantage of you. And a lot of times car dealers and others will try to add in things that you don't want. Tell them you don't want them, right? I don't want all the bells and whistles. I don't need leather seats or this, that, and the other thing. I just need a basic model, right? You have to be clear about that with them, and don't let yourself get pushed into those things, which is often what happens. Okay. So when you prepare for financial agreements, it's really important to define your objectives. What's my goal here? Really important. Okay. Research other parties' financial offerings, right? If it's a mortgage, what are other people offering? How does all this compare? Know your value. Go in prepared. Take notes on offers presented so you can think about it, and review and revisit. Don't feel like you have to go in and agree in the moment or on the spot. In fact, best not to do that in many instances. And a lot of salespeople will get nervous. For a lot of salespeople, their mantra is don't let you leave without agreeing, because a lot of times people won't agree once they leave. Keep that in mind as part of this process. And by the way, I don't know if any of you have used artificial intelligence. There's obviously a lot of conversation about it, and Chat GPT and other kinds of things. You can put into Chat GPT preparing for a car negotiation, and it will give you a really useful list of questions to ask a dealer or somebody like that. Okay, so use the tools that are available to you as part of this process. Don't be afraid of them. They're there for you. So in terms of summarizing, and just to give us a few minutes for any kind of questions, first and foremost, don't be afraid to ask. If you don't ask, the answer will always be no. As Michael Jordan once said, you miss 100% of the shots you never take. Take a shot. And again, somebody asked, could you somehow derail the negotiation? Could you cause offense? Don't just think about what you want to say or what you want to ask. Think about how. How can I frame this in a way that the other person will take it in, right? Make sure that you read and understand the agreements you'll be signing. If you don't understand things, stop. Take the time to find those kinds of things out. The Office of Economic Empowerment can be helpful here to you. Do shop around. This is the great equalizer that you have in these kinds of situations, is these companies want your business, and there are a lot of them out there. Don't hesitate to play them off on each other to meet your needs as best as possible, because they're going to do that to you as a consumer. And be empowered by the information and the preparation that you do. Okay. the more research, the more information you gather, the better off you're going to be going into these situations. Okay, so enough of me talking. What kind of questions do people have about all of this? Is there anything unclear? Is there anything I can help you with that I have not talked to you about thus far? So Jessica, can people raise their hands or is it just in the chat?
Yes, people can raise their hands if they'd like to, and we can take them off mute. We also have the Q&A function, which you're welcome to use, where you can ask questions anonymously if you prefer to ask anonymously, and of course regularly. And I know that there's a lot of conversation in the chat, so feel free to utilize any of those. I know we did have something come in from Casey about suggested reading.
Yeah, there are a lot of good books. There's actually, the really nice thing about negotiation is there's a lot of good books and they're kind of written for a more popular audience. So, Jessica, I think in the past I've sent a reading list to folks at the office. If you don't have that, I can resend it and you can share that with everybody. But absolutely, and the one that I would definitely start with that changed the landscape of negotiation back in 1981, believe it or not, was a book called Getting to Yes. And it was written by Fisher and Urey. If you haven't read it, it's very, very valuable. And it's created a whole host of other books that are out there that build off of this idea of more of an interest-based approach to negotiation. So recommend that, that's one you take a look at, but there are quite a few others that we can also share. Absolutely. Any other questions or comments?
And I'll make sure to circulate that book list once we have that in the follow-up email so everybody can get it.
Okay. I also wrote a book a few years back about cases. It's called the Book of Real World Negotiations, and it's cases of 25 different kinds of negotiations that exist and that happened. And my purpose was actually to help people to understand that negotiation is often not what you think it is. And if you read through that book, you'll see a lot of different kinds of examples, and you'll actually see very little compromise. What you'll see is a lot of creativity, a lot of problem solving, a lot of thinking together, etc. So that's another one. But again, there's lots of other ones out there that are really valuable and worth reading. Any other comments, questions? And by the way, feel free, Jessica has my email. You can feel free to reach out if after the fact you do have a question. I'm happy to answer it. It may take me a couple of days to get to you, but I will get to it. And so I'm more than happy to answer a question, especially if you don't feel comfortable putting something in the chat, or maybe after the fact you've looked around a little bit and you're still a bit unclear. Feel free to reach out to me as part of this. Yeah, I am on LinkedIn, by the way, and I do post pretty regularly on different negotiation subjects. The other thing I would recommend, by the way, is so I'm connected to a place called the Program on Negotiation, which is based at Harvard Law School. Their website is www.pon.harvard.edu, and they have a newsletter free. They put out a lot of free information on new research and other kinds of things related to negotiation. So I would really encourage you to sign up. It doesn't cost you anything, and it's great to kind of keep up and keep learning about how you do all of these kinds of things.
Dr. Weiss, I'm going to interrupt here because we do have a question in the question and answer, which is how do you influence a negotiator to fully understand the objectives?
So part of it is, one of the things I like to do is I like to actually put myself in their shoes a little bit. And I found that that's one of the best ways of influencing people is to say to the other, tell me about the kind of constraints or challenges that you have as part of this process. Or, what's most valuable and useful for you here. And when you do that, people are a little surprised because most people are thinking that you're just going to be very focused on what's important to you. And if you ask people, for example, like, what are the constraints that you're under in your role? Like, is this something you can do? People appreciate that. And so inquiring, asking is one way of influencing people. And I think it's also important um, to share your story. You know, we don't use stories nearly enough in negotiation, but I've found that people really relate to stories. So for example, if you've experienced a challenge, you can say, you know, I'm really interested in getting a mortgage from you all, and I've got some challenges. Do you mind if I just tell you a little bit about how I got here, right? Because maybe you ran into problems and challenges like we all do in life. And what that does is it creates some empathy with the other negotiator. And it's a lot harder for them to say, well, I don't really care about the fact that, you know, your parents got sick and right. Like that's not how most people are. Some people, perhaps, you know, there are always difficult people, but if you share a story, what I find is that people are actually often very open to listening and hearing that. And there still may be constraints, but they're going to relate to you in a different way. So I would try to think as you go into these negotiations about if you have some challenges or problems, to feel free to share a story that will help the other side to understand that and perhaps to work with you a little more effectively.
Great. And I think we have one last question that might have been buried by the chat.
Okay.
Forgive my not knowing what this term is, but would you be able to explain WATNA? Whatna?
So a WATNA, is it's a less used term. It's kind of like BATNA, but a WATNA is your worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. So in other words, you know, sometimes people will say, I don't worry so much about my BATNA, right? And that walk away piece, but I worry about what's the worst thing that the other negotiator could do to you. And I had somebody once say to me, you know, if I'm going to come out of this alive, I'm okay. Um, and it's sort of a different way of thinking about it, but it's asking, you know, does the other side have sort of leverage over you in a certain way, and is that going to create a problem or challenge for you as part of your negotiation? Um, I tend to think more along the lines of BATNA, but what's useful when it comes to BATNA, right, is again, that's kind of this walk away alternative. It's also valuable to ask, what's the BATNA of the other negotiator that I'm dealing with? So if we don't reach agreement here, what happens to them? Well, they lose it on my business, right? You know, and for example, with car dealers, as you get toward the end of the month, they often have a quota, right? So they might need a deal with you as much as you want one with them because they have to meet their quota, things like that. So them walking away is not so easy. They might have more give in their terms as you get toward the end of the month, or even in particular, the end of a year, right? So knowing how these different entities, what their metrics are, how salespeople are judged and things like that can also be very valuable. And there's a good bit written about that you can find again online and in different places.
Great. And I think that's all the questions we had, which is perfect because it is almost 1 o'clock. So that was a wonderful session. And thank you everybody for asking questions. I'll make sure to follow up with the links we just in the follow-up email. And thank you again for this wonderful presentation. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm going to be taking it with me to my next negotiations too.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Enjoy the nice weather in New England, at least. So
Wonderful. Thank you,
bye-bye.
everybody. And please answer the survey. Thank you.
Bye.